So good evening, everybody. I'm Father Nick Austin, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening for this joint talk hosted by Campion Hall and the Laudato Si Research Institute. Campion Hall is the home of the Jesuits in Oxford and a centre for postgraduate study and research in the University of Oxford. And it's also the proud home of the Laudato Si Research Institute, which conducts transdisciplinary dialogue on issues of eco-social change. So I'll just hand over now to the director of the Laudato Si Research Institute, Dr. Celia Dean Drummond, who will introduce our speaker and our topic this evening. So over to you, Celia.
Thank you very much, and a warm welcome from me, Celia Dean Drummond, to all of you here. And also, it's a special honour and privilege to have John Berkman with us as a fellow for about 5 months over this year, and he's very kindly to offer this lecture tonight. But I'm going to introduce him to you this evening. So he's Professor of Moral Theology at Regis College and at the Graduate Centre for Theological Studies at the University of Toronto. He previously taught at the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology in Berkeley, California, and was director of the Division of Moral Theology and Ethics at the Catholic University of America. In the area of environmental ethics, he's been reflecting theologically on non-human animals for almost 30 years, beginning with a Trinitarian theology of the chief end of all flesh with Stanley Hauerwas in 1992, and then more recently, Must We Love Non-Human Animals, a post-Laudato Si Thomistic perspective, in May 2021, published in New Blackfriars. He's a fellow of the ISSR and recently finished a term serving on the Faith and Witness Commission of the Canadian Council of Churches. He teaches and writes in healthcare ethics and is editing the Oxford Handbook of Theological Bioethics, and he's currently engaged in a number of projects on the early philosophy of Elizabeth Anscombe, with the influence of Victor White and Blackfriars Dominicans on a young Elizabeth Anscombe, appearing in the September 2021 Jubilee issue of New Blackfriars. So the title of his talk tonight is A Political Theology of Land, Pre-Colonial and Post-Colonial Perspectives on the Situation of First Nations in Canada. So thank you so much, John, for being with us tonight. It's a real honour and pleasure to have you, and we're all looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you. Thank you.
First, I wish to express my sincere thanks to Professor Dean Drummond, Director of the Laudato Si Research Institute, for inviting me to come to the Institute this year, and to the entire staff of the LSRI for welcoming me so warmly. I also wish to express my thanks to Father Nicholas Austin, Master of Campion Hall, and to the Board of Campion Hall for welcoming me as a visiting fellow this year. I am truly grateful for the generosity and hospitality I've been shown already, having been welcomed so warmly into a most convivial academic community. With regards to my presentation today, this is a new topic for me, newer than I originally expected. I came at this topic originally from an interest in the concept of international justice embodied in the tradition of the law of nations, particularly as a way of regulating and limiting war. I thought it might be deployed as a critique of such things as the doctrine of discovery, which was used to justify the colonial project in North America, and come to a more adequate understanding of how the land was understood both by the settlers and the Indigenous peoples. However, as I read extensively in the history of New France and what the British called the province of Quebec, it was clear that the French and the British recognized full well that the various nations of Indigenous peoples were fully capable of running their own affairs, and possessed the land upon which they resided. Some of these indigenous peoples were hunters, others were farmers of varying crops, and others were miners of minerals like copper. All of these indigenous nations traded with each other to obtain goods that the other nations were able to grow, find, or hunt in abundance. Some goods were desired for food, others for making clothes or tools, and others, like tobacco, for cultural and religious purposes. So I reoriented my focus to the 18th century treaties and agreements that the British signed with regards to indigenous peoples, which are the primary basis for ongoing negotiations at present between various indigenous peoples and the Canadian government. I hope to understand from that context competing understandings of land. However, it became clear to me that there was no hope of making sense of these historical treaties without putting them in their historical context. What was going on when they were signed, which would provide a context for reading them. That's the first historical section of my presentation. In the light of the historical context of these treaties and what has happened since then, one can get a sense as to how these treaties might be helpful in resolving various historical injustices and the limits of such treaties. One also has to look at the extent to which current governments and indigenous peoples have incommensurable views of society and of land. And that is the second section of my presentation. The final section, I'm concerned with differences in conceptions of land between the governments in North America and indigenous peoples, because I think these negotiations have founded in part on fundamental theological differences in the understandings of land. And that is my third section, examining how theological differences in the conception of land must be addressed if a full and just resolution is going to be possible. Let me briefly note in the presentation, I will use a number of terms for Indigenous peoples of Canada. Most commonly, the current term used is First Nations, though technically the term should be First Nations, the Métis people, and the Inuit. But I will use First Nations for short. And at times in looking at historical documents, I will also refer to Indians, which is the language used in them, and in fact is also the language used by one of the theorists, indigenous theorists I'm drawing on, Vine Deloria. So those three terms will be used at various points in the presentation. And finally, I dedicate this presentation to my beloved aunt, Edith Ann Geer, who died on October 15th of this year. She was a wonderful aunt, deeply involved in my life when I was young. She lived incredibly simply and dedicated her years to serving those who needed her wherever she could. She lived an incredibly successful life, though not in any worldly terms. She is now in the communion of the saints, and this presentation attempts to honor, in some small way, the earthly life she lived in such fullness. At a recent point in my research, I came across the following claim by Professor Taiki Alfred, a member of the Six Nations in Ontario, whose various lands are within the borders of Canada. He says, for settlers in Canada, psychological and legal security exists only because settlers refuse to examine their government's agenda and policies, as well as their own attitudes through a self-critical lens, one that is open to a full spectrum of logical conclusions, some of whose truth may burn brightly enough to scar the precious emotional attachments they have to the founding myths of their country and their personalities. Yet this self-examination, either by settler or many Onkwehonwe, which means indigenous in Mohawk, themselves, simply does not occur in the course of social and political relations in colonial countries. The severe, destructive, and disagreeing effect of colonization in Onkwehonwe communities make such self-examination nearly unthinkable in most people's minds. Instead, accommodations with colonialism are sought after and celebrated. This statement struck me powerfully, and it made me rethink what I was going to do in this presentation and to reorient it as an opportunity to take up his challenge, namely to examine the history of what is now called Canada as it relates to the Indigenous peoples through a self-critical lens, despite the fact that, as he puts it so well, it is almost unthinkable on a variety of levels. So following the work of Alfred and Corntassel, I understand the Indigenous peoples to be just that, indigenous to the lands they inhabit. Furthermore, the cultures and religions of these Indigenous peoples in North America have always been and continue to be closely tied up with their land. Since the Europeans arrived, the Indigenous peoples of Canada have, according to the political and cultural logic of colonialism, been steadily dispossessed of their lives, their lands, their political sovereignty or self-determination, and to the extent possible, their languages, their religions, and their cultures. At times, the process has been overt, at other times more subtle. Today, the conflict is largely described through the public relations of the Canadian government's massive bureaucracy currently known as Indigenous Affairs. While the logic of colonialism has proceeded historically, there have been times when it has been in their strategic interest to make proclamations and promises to the Indigenous peoples in the form of what have become to be called treaties. Now, certainly there are some colonial leaders at particular times have tried to act honorably despite the colonizing logic, but historically their efforts have had little impact. Like any underclass in a society, the options of the poor and oppressed are limited at best, and while First Nations have often refused offers and tried to negotiate well, particularly when they have a certain degree of power in a situation, the British themselves in their declarations recognized that they have almost always been taken, that the First Nations have almost always been taken advantage of by the colonizers. This has been the situation and continues to be the situation in Canada. Disputes over land are going on all over Canada and have been for many, many years. They are resolved incredibly slowly, and since the power to resolve them is overwhelmingly in the hands of the Canadian government, that is where the responsibility for this must lie. In this presentation, I will introduce these problems through a focus on one of the 10 places that were named in Maclean's magazine at the end of 2020. I'm focusing on number 7 at the bottom of the map, the example closest to my home in Toronto. It concerns land about an hour west of Toronto. The headline is something like this: a deadlock continues in Caledonia, a community west of Toronto, as protesters from the Six Nations of the Grand River demonstrate against a nearby housing development that they claim is on unceded territory. More than 24 people have been arrested for violating an injunction to allow work on the site, named Mackenzie Meadows. Over the summer and into the fall of 2020, barricades and occupations were broken up by police. Indigenous leaders in the area are pushing for meetings with provincial and federal counterparts to discuss the dispute. One of these treaties was known as the Haldeman Declaration of 1784. The lower map shows the land granted to the Six Nations in 1784, a treaty between the Crown and the Six Nations, that this tract of land was to be one which the Six Nations, quote, and their posterity were to enjoy forever. You'll see in the lower map that there's a little orange part which represents about 5% of the original grant. That is the area in the upper map, and that is the portion currently under the control of the Six Nations. While I cannot analyze the specific claims, suffice to say that much of the land under the treaty was not ceded and has been unlawfully taken from the Six Nations. The area of land in dispute that I just read about is that little red circle just outside the current land that is in First Nations hands still. Okay, a brief historical perspective. For our purposes, the arrangements that the French had with the Indigenous peoples is beyond the scope of my presentation. However, it is generally agreed that the Indigenous people had it better under the French at that time than under the British. When conflicts arose, the Indigenous peoples generally sided with the French. In this map, from 1750, the blue area is what was known as New France, and the dark orange area were the 13 colonies, and the areas at the bottom in orange were Spanish territory. There are a number of reasons for why the Indigenous people generally got on better with the French. But certainly one of the reasons may well be that in 13 colonies, the populations were much bigger and were pushing at their borders and were expanding at that time into much of what was then French territory. And what is very important is what happens next after this point in 1750. You have the 7 Years' War, which ends with the Treaty of Paris in February of 1763. Now, before that, in the decades or two, the British had agreed that the 13 colonies were to be stayed east of the Appalachian Mountains, that all waters that flowed in the Atlantic were part of the colonies, but all waters beyond the Appalachian Mountains, which didn't flow into the Atlantic, were to be considered Indian lands. And what then happens is that these lands, in 1763, under the Treaty of Paris, become British territory. Right around that time of the end of the war, there were a lot of British settlers throughout what was thought supposed to be Indian land. And around the time the treaty was signed, an Indigenous leader, Pontiac, formed a confederation with almost every nation from the lower Mississippi through to the upper Great Lakes area. And they decided that they would basically, this is their only opportunity to basically drive the settlers out of what had been agreed was their territory. And they caused quite a lot of destruction. They took over various forts, at least 8 or 9 of them, and basically devastated the communities around those forts. And the war was still raging in October of 1763. At that point, the British King, George III, recognized that the British had been mistaken in the way they had dealt with the Indigenous peoples, and they needed to come to peace with them. That the destruction was such that it was not in their interest to continue this. They basically wanted 13 colonies to stay where they were and to trade with Europe and not go into the hinterlands. And so they reserved the lands further in to the Indians. And this is what this proclamation, it's not a treaty in the sense that 2 sovereign nations agreed upon it, simply George III proclaimed it. He said, "It is just and reasonable, essential to our interests and the security of our colonies, that the several nations of Indians should not be disturbed or molested in the possession of such parts of our dominions, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, which are reserved to them. we strictly forbid our subjects from making any purchases or taking possession of any of the lands reserved. All persons who have seated themselves upon any lands not having been ceded to or purchased by us, forthwith to remove themselves. Great frauds and abuses have been committed in purchasing lands of the Indians, to the great prejudice of our interests and to the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians, to the end that the Indians may be convinced of our justice. No private person do presume to make any purchase from the Indians of any lands reserved to the Indians. If said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, the same shall be purchased only by the Crown at some public assembly of the said Indians and by the governor. Now, once the British were granted New France in 1763, as you'll see, the province of Quebec was actually quite a small piece of land up in the top, and all the land in purple were to be Indian lands. Now, here's something I found when I took a quick look at the map on the left, which came from a Princeton University website, that in fact the borders of the 13 colonies are all wrong. They put in the actual 13 states and not limited to the land east of the Appalachians. I thought it was rather extraordinary that a contemporary map at a Princeton University would in fact mess up the borders so radically. You can see the picture on the right is much closer to where the borders of the 13 colonies were. But I picked it because it showed basically very obviously what the land that was understood to be Indian lands. It had not been ceded by them, it had not been purchased by them. Now, what is then significant is what goes on is that over the next 11 years, there are more proclamations, not agreements, that expands Quebec in 1774. So Quebec is now 3 times as large as it had previously been. They simply unilaterally declared that to be part of their territories. What then took place, obviously, if we're in 1774, is a year later, after this Quebec Act, war broke out between the 13 colonies and Britain. Within upstate New York, on Indian land, was a remarkable man, Thayendanegea, also known as Joseph Brant. Brant was a remarkable military leader. He led many raids and won many victories, siding with the British against the 13 colonies who were seeking to expand up into the province of Quebec. He sought to represent the interests of his people very well. He repeatedly went to England and was courted by King George III to keep his people with the British. This painting of him was painted by one of the leading court painters in England at the time. And as well, during the Revolutionary Wars, he was asked to go to Washington, was invited by Washington and others to ask him to join their side, but he refused. And he remained with the British when they were basically driven out of most of upstate New York. Now, in 1784, with the Second Treaty of Paris, the British ceded basically most of that land of Quebec, which they in fact given to the Indians or acknowledged they owned. They simply transferred it to the Americans. And the First Nations, the Indigenous people, thought this was the greatest possible betrayal because they gave away land that wasn't theirs to give. It was understood not to be British land. It was understood to be unceded land that was belonging to the Indigenous peoples. And so when they lost that conflict, they had a lot of very, very unhappy Indigenous people living in the much smaller province of Quebec, basically Upper and Lower Canada, the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And very shortly after that was concluded, the governor of Quebec, John Haldeman, realized that he needed to provide land for Joseph Brant and all the Six Nations people who had fought on the British side and who had lost their lands. So he had the Haldeman Proclamation in 1784. And this is what created that tract of land I mentioned in the first conflict at the beginning. His Majesty, in consideration of the early attachment to his cause manifested by the Mohawk Indians and of the loss of their settlement, which they thereby sustained, a tract of land under his protection should be chosen as a safe retreat for them and others of the Six Nations. I have the earnest desire of many of His Majesty's faithful allies, note allies, not subjects, purchase a tract of land from the Mississauga Indians, and I authorize the said Mohawk Nation and others of the Six Nations to take possession of and settle upon the banks of the Grand River, running 6 miles deep from each side of the river, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in that proportion to the head of the said river, which them and their posterity are to enjoy forever. We heard already about them and their posterity enjoying forever. The land that you can see on the map on the right was what was originally granted to them. And then various succeeding governors of Ontario began to unilaterally announce that there were mistakes in that agreement, problems. They were giving them land that they hadn't purchased. They lost the survey map. And the one on the right is a map that was done 40 years later, which had about 1/3 less territory than was in the original declaration. And without going into great details, over the process of the next 200 years, their land went from about 600,000 square kilometers to about 30,000. All right, now, there's a great plan of assimilation through the 19th and most of the 20th century until in the 1970s, the Supreme Court of Canada recognized the legitimacy of the historic treaties between Britain and First Nations peoples. Furthermore, in the Canadian Constitution of 1982, both the rights of Indigenous peoples and their treaty rights were definitively enshrined into what is taken to be the document with supreme legal authority in Canada. However, such documents presume on a fundamental level that the Indigenous people are fundamentally living under Canadian sovereignty, which I take it is the deepest underlying issue. In these continued dealings, the underlying and real question is one of sovereignty. Now, in this situation of negotiations, the government really has nothing to gain and a lot to lose. Rapid progress in negotiations would likely make a government unpopular. And so much effort and expense is on certain ways of framing the situation in Canada. Now, why there's been such difficulty coming to resolution? It's obviously an incredibly complex issue. with many kinds of reasons. However, I want to look at what I take to be at least one key reason: a clear inability for the two parties to agree on the very conception of land of the other party. Now, throughout colonial history in Canada, the functioning presumption has been the sovereignty of the Crown, with all rights or powers of the Indigenous peoples being determined unilaterally by the Crown. These treaties that have been mentioned were generally not signed by two parties. They were simply pronouncements by the Crown in English, these treaties that I've read to you, of what they promised to do. But they wrote the treaties and designed the language of them and so forth and so on. Now, there's been an intense focus in Canada in recent years on the evils of the residential schools. There were certainly horrors perpetrated, and it's a sad legacy. But all of the schools stemmed from government imposition of a particular system. And by having focus on the residential schools is the one place where the government can place attention on various churches which administered them under strict government direction. And it keeps the attention from the much broader government efforts to eliminate the indigeneity of First Nations people. For example, in a recent book by Sheila Rogers, what used to be called Indian Affairs, or the Indian Act, is now called Indigenous Affairs. She notes it's more or less a super province. It has a $200 billion budget to deliver services to First Nations people. Yet, as she notes, as of 2019, not a single person has been elected by Indigenous people to represent their interests, how they actually want that money to be spent. And when, in certain negotiations with Indigenous peoples, the representative for negotiating on behalf of First Nations are chosen by the government, which obviously is a huge problem when they can simply pick a representative of the other party, and then if things don't go well with that representative, then just pick another representative. And Rogers asks, might the social inequities evident in First Nations communities be a symptom of complete institutional powerlessness in these communities? Traditionally, Indigenous people did not have the right to vote, which in some sense was a mixed blessing, in that there was some acknowledgement that they weren't Canadians, so to speak. They were a different people. And in 1960, the federal government granted First Nations the right to vote in Canada without consulting them, for example, about whether they wanted that right to vote, whether they wanted to be seen as having that right of citizens, or whether they saw themselves that way. Now, from 1830 until 1960, successive governments in Canada made a series of rules designed to take away this treaty Indian status that they possessed under the treaties from as many Indigenous people as it could. So it created all kinds of regulations about what an Indigenous person had to do to keep their status as being represented by the treaties. So, for example, women who married anyone outside the nation lost their status as an Indigenous person under the treaties, as did their children. If an Indigenous person became a medical doctor, a lawyer, or was ordained to ministry, they lost their Indigenous status under treaty, as did getting a university degree. Losing one's status by the Canadian government was called being enfranchised. And those who were enfranchised had to leave the community. They could no longer live on Indigenous lands. And they were also granted a portion of the assets of the First Nation that they left. which the government was holding on to for them. This last point is extremely important. In stripping status from First Nations individuals and giving them their portion of First Nations assets, which the government entirely controlled, they not only denied sovereignty of the First Nations, but the government denied them any nation status at all. They were simply a group of individuals who happened to have a pot of assets in common. Their status as a nation, as a community, was not recognized, and this, seeing them as groups of individuals, pitted First Nations peoples against each other by being financially squeezed if a First Nations individual pursued an education or married outside the nation. Now, First Nations people continue to seek redress under the treaties, insist that the Crown respect the spirit and intent embodied in the treaties that were signed, not quibbling over how to legally interpret the terms, all of which were stated in ways advantageous to the Crown, who wrote up the treaties in English, not in both languages, and then got agreement from various First Nations. Now, the advantages of using treaties for negotiations, despite the many times they've been broken, is that it formally recognizes, in some sense, that there are two sovereign powers who are supposed to be negotiating. That is the very definition of a treaty. And it is a basis on which governments will negotiate, which is better than the alternative. The disadvantage, of course, is that the colonizing powers have repeatedly broken, unilaterally changed, and unilaterally interpreted existing treaties. And secondly, when colonizing powers rule Indigenous peoples on their own lands, denying almost any form of self-determination and self-government, how can you actually have negotiations which are supposed to presuppose good faith negotiations between two independent nations? Now, one of the important arguments of certain First Nations theorists is they don't want to be seen simply as victims. They don't simply want to be complaining all the time. And rather, they want to think about what's central for the renewal of Indigenous communities. And those are the key practices and convictions that provide traditional and authentic identity to Indigenous cultures in Canada. First, the land and its multivalent significance. Secondly, maintaining native languages, spoken and written. The third point is that relationships and understanding of them are based on kinship, which I want to say a bit more about, the importance of their culture and ceremonies, and also of their spirituality and their theology. My last point on the politics is the importance of, in First Nations, recognizing that all relationships are understood in relation to kin relationships. As Vine Delory once said, no doubt a little bit hyperbolically, if you are not a kin, you do not exist. And relations in and among tribes and with those outside are understood as extended kin relationships. Similarly, responsibilities to others are conceptualized by analogy of kin relationship responsibilities. In the Jesuit Relations, which document better than any source the 17th century, there are repeated examples of First Nations on capturing prisoners. There are basically two options. You either kill them or you make them part of your tribe. And they're example both of missionaries and people from other tribe who went through an extensive ceremony, and after that, they were simply another member of the tribe. And certain settlers said once that ceremony was over, they were treated exactly like any other member of the tribe. And no difference was made. And so this history of understanding things in terms of kin relationships was taken and continues to be taken very seriously in a way that I think our culture finds it hard to imagine. Okay, finally, I want to say a few things about land and a colonial theology of land. When our settlers' ears hear sacred land, it's probably hard to avoid connotations of either a romanticism or spirituality of some New Age type. Now, historically, settlers coming to North America typically left an extensive kin structure behind in a homeland to come to a new world. And in the colonial mindset, land was free and without any inherent significance. More importantly, 18th century North American expansion was driven by entrepreneurs, those who planned to get rich by land speculation. Land was viewed as pure commodity, often an extremely profitable one. In many ways, North American settlers were among the first to embody Adam Smith's vision of a mobile workforce freed from traditional bonds to kin and hearth, molded into economic units in a capitalist-driven economy. Now, Vin Deloria talks about 4 ways that land can be seen as holy. Now, Deloria's account is powerful because he has a strong doctrine of revelation. His account of Holy Land is anchored in God's self-revelation in the past and God's ongoing work in the world. Deloria presents his account of the various ways in which particular land is sacred to First Nations people by drawing analogies to scriptural accounts. As he puts it, part of the narrative of First Nations people is that God has led them to their land, and that is where they are supposed to live. Thus, when First Nations were resettled, quote unquote, they were effectively being sent into exile. Now, as the history of Jews make clear, one can learn to live in exile from the land that has been given to you by God, and that's the way it has been with almost all First Nations people living in exile within North America. The first example he gives is of a reverence for land that is not holy per se, but land that is reverenced because of historical events that we wish to remember. This is an example of the massacre at Wounded Knee and a memorial there, but we also have reverence for places, whether it's in America, Gettysburg, or in Canada, the Plains of Abraham. These have both been made national parks in their respective countries. That land is not simply a commodity. Secondly, Deloria speaks about sacred places. More important for First Nations people are places on their land that are truly sacred, where the Creator's communicated to them through some action on their behalf. For a number of reasons, these truly sacred places are typically not made publicly known by First Nations people, for reasons that are both completely understandable, I take it to us, and others that we might not know or understand. Deloria draws an analogy to a sacred place in First Nations theology with the scriptural example of the crossing of the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant. During the crossing, Joshua orders 12 stones to be taken from the river bottom and set up nearby, where they will serve as a sign of God's actions on that day. The third and most significant is what Deloria refers to as holy ground. For First Nations people, there are places where the divine self-reveals. Sometimes the holiness of such a place requires a return to worship, to pay homage, perform sacrifices, and other ceremonies. And these are considered essential that God's people may be saved from misfortune or destruction. And of course, there are similar analogies in Christianity, in Judaism, in Islam, and so forth. And finally, Deloria emphasizes the importance of ongoing revelation. That a place can become sacred because God reveals himself anew, a place of a new revelation. Now, that God may reveal himself anew must be part of any religion that understands itself to serve a living God. Deloria notes that when First Nations have dealt with governments, the idea of land being holy because of a new revelation is most typically ruled out. And the logic of debunking such experiences tends to go on in such cases by government representatives. They argue that any sacred place must have been established a very long time ago and have been continuously affirmed. While Deloria understands in part the concerns of such bodies not to be manipulated, government claims that they will only recognize actions of God long in the past are effectively denying that God could possibly act in our own time. To Deloria, such a denial is to affirm that First Nations do not worship a living, but a dead God. And again, I could give examples of analogies in other religions. So finally, my summary. In my discussion of the significance, sacredness, or holiness of particular places on the land for First Nations people, I have by no means exhausted the various ways in which particular lands and places have intrinsic significance for First Nations people. What I have tried to show is why particular land is of particular significance for First Nations people. Such places cannot simply be bought or compensated for by other land or money. Holy land is not valuable in economic terms, it is invaluable. Its importance and the respect due to it rightly transcends economic or political considerations. In conclusion, I think if there's to be any hope for a proper resolution of land claims by First Nations, the land of the First Nations cannot simply be seen as a negotiation of commodities. Such negotiations only continue to deny Indigenous cultures, narratives, languages, and religions. Thank you.
Thank you, John, so much for that really stimulating and illuminating lecture. And we've now got time for a few minutes of questions, first from those in the live audience here, and then those of you online, if you want to think about questions and send them in, we will have an opportunity for one or two of those as well. So anybody like to kick us off with the first question? Yes, this, Frank.
Thank you very much, John. Very fascinating. Thank you very much, John. Fascinating. A quick point about the last claim, the God of the land claims that arise from the ongoing revelation of God. It's obviously going to run into the problem that they are generalizing this, that they need this to be acknowledged by people who don't share that sense of revelation. I'm thinking of Israel-Palestine, where the same land is subject to claims of being waqf, because Muhammad has passed over it, and to being the promised land of Scripture. There's no way, so all they can achieve is a truce. They can never make a peace which renounces that claim. Is there some kind of equivalent to that at play here?
Right. Well, I think your example is excellent in terms of what can happen when two different religions or cultures see the significance of a place that transcends kind of negotiations in terms of economics, etc. But as far as I know, there aren't such places in Canada at present that would have those two kind of binding significances that would prevent resolution. My point rather is to try to show in one way in which these kinds of considerations have to be taken into account beyond simply the economic. It's most common for governments simply to offer financial compensation to whenever they're trying to resolve land. And what they don't understand is that First Nations don't think about the land the way they do, as it's something you simply buy and sell and then move on to something else, because they have an importance to place in a way most North Americans never have had. And the irony, of course, is that the colonizers are called settlers, where in fact we're about the most mobile people that have ever existed in the world. And in fact, the First Nations are actually settling on land in a way that the rest of us often don't.
So thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm thinking of the landmark essay done by Robert Warrior called Canaanites, Cowboys, and Indians. And he himself was a First Nation person in North America and was brought up in a Catholic school. And he then rereads the Exodus through the lens of Indigenous peoples and says essentially this notion of manifest destiny that comes with the settlers and with their understanding or their identifying of the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is such that that therefore makes that sort of sense of colonization and sometimes like the obliteration of Indigenous people almost self-evident. So after years of wrestling, he then decides that he can no longer be a Roman Catholic because he feels that that inevitably is the God of conquest. So I guess the question I want to pose is, how is all of this, I guess, as a political theology of land worked through when you have Indigenous people who are Catholic or more broadly Christians? I mean, does that change the narrative in terms of how one thinks about land, or is it solely from an Indigenous, I guess, sort of religious or spiritual perspective?
Right. Great question, fantastic question, and there are a number of layers to it, which I'll try to very, very quickly tease out. Now, first of all, this may have to do with competing Indigenous theologies. Vine Deloria argues that pretty well every First Nation group has an understanding of the land they live on as at some time in the past being led to that land by God and being told, this is your land. Now, whether that land was occupied and they drove somebody else out, whether it was unoccupied land, that's a far too complex question. By drawing analogies to Israel, I'm not trying to necessarily, I was trying to draw analogies that people would understand in terms of, that might be more familiar with their own traditions, that would help make sense of these First Nations claims. Now, you know, whether when Israel went into the Promised Land, to what extent they actually vanquished others, and to what extent they actually went to unoccupied land, is a whole complex question that needs to be thought out. But I think that's far beyond what I can take on here. But I do think what I would like to see is, in some sense, engaging these theological questions among First Nations groups to think through them more adequately, and so they can be recognized as an important part of any satisfactory negotiations.
Bethany, do you want to?
I was really interested by the question of the vote in the 1960s. Are there any people any First Nations people who want to go back on that?
No idea, and I'm not sure if they had an option, or do have an option. But I would take it if on analogy with, say, the independence of the province of Quebec, which voted 49% for somewhat percentage to leave. How would that work out? I don't know. And I'm not sure how it would work out with First Nations, considering how the fact that they have huge numbers of tiny pieces of land all over the place. But I'm not sure their situation could in general get much worse than it is under the current regime.
Okay, I think we're going to move over to some online questions now. So I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's going to read out one or two questions, and then the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then we need to close.
So one online question is as follows. What are the reasons for which Canada has not endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? If it did, would it change the political landscape and lead to a greater respect for Indigenous cultures and land? And we're in our last 4 minutes or so now, Celia.
Well, that's a very well-informed questioner, and it's an excellent question, and I don't think the answer to it is very complicated. It's very interesting that according to Teaiki Alfred, he discusses the former Chief Justice in Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, in 2001, acknowledging that First Nations land claims were difficult because clearly international community expects Canada to address them justly. And then she brought up that very United Nations agreement and said something along the lines of, thankfully, we haven't signed on to that. So if the attitude of the Chief Justice of Canada is to see this as primarily or solely a legal problem, which is being pressured by the international community, and that's why Canada should act on it, it doesn't bode very well for assumptions about how the Canadian government more generally thinks about the issue.
I think maybe one more short question, Tim, and then we'll finish. No? Did you want to do another one online, Tim, or do you want to close off?
I think nothing more online.
Okay, so I think at this point we're going to have to finish the session because those who are online expect a certain end point. So we could go on for another half an hour or longer, I'm sure. So, but I'd just like to thank those who have been listening online for coming, and you know, I think what we've heard has been really stimulating. Has made us think very carefully and self-reflectively about our own histories and the impact on others. So I just want to hand over once more to you, John, and the audience to express our appreciation for what you've contributed for us this evening. So thank you again.